so many misconceptions about what it means to be Native American.
That's a real issue?
Yes, it doesn't exist, but there's some kind of fantasy.
A 4,000-year-old skeleton found deep in the rugged plains of northern China has just cracked open one of the oldest mysteries of human migration. At first, archaeologists expected another routine study, but when the bones were tested, the results pushed everything off course. The DNA carried a genetic fingerprint long believed to belong only to the earliest Native American ancestors. One ancient life, separated by continents and millennia, suddenly bridged two worlds. Something extraordinary happened thousands of years ago, and this discovery may finally expose how. Join us as we step into this mystery and uncover what the evidence truly suggests. Mysterious ancients of the Red Deer Cave. Archaeologists spent the late 20th century moving through some of the most hidden places on Earth, and one of their biggest surprises came when they pushed into the far northwest of China. They dug through the edge of the Tarim Basin, a place that looked empty but carried secrets under its sand. This huge stretch of land sat inside the Taklamakan Desert, a place that people used to avoid because it destroyed almost anything that tried to cross it. The strange thing was that this deadly desert turned out to be one of the best natural storage rooms for the past. The soil held salt, and the air stayed dry, so anything buried there could stay preserved for thousands of years. When researchers dug deeper, they came across a burial ground. Inside it, they pulled out bodies that still had shape, skin, clothing, and hair. These were not mummies made with oils or wrapped in cloth like the famous ones in Egypt. These bodies had stayed whole simply because the desert froze them in time. When dating tests came back, the numbers shocked the scientists. The remains had been lying there for nearly 4,000 years, waiting to be discovered. But the age was not what made people stare. What truly caused the world to pay attention was the appearance of these ancient bodies. They did not look like the early Chinese populations historians expected to find there. Instead, they carried clear European features. Some had reddish blonde hair that still clung to their skulls. Others had long faces, strong noses, round eyes, and thick beards. Every detail pointed toward a group that came from far away. One body became famous everywhere. It was a woman often called the Beauty of Lulon. She wore wool clothing, soft felt hats, and leather boots. Her style looked like it came from ancient people of Northern Europe, maybe from old cultures in Scotland or Scandinavia. Researchers began drawing up theories and throwing out new ideas as they tried to piece things together. Some believed these people had traveled through forgotten trade routes long before the Silk Road became known. Others pushed the idea that they were part of a lost migration. A few even linked them to the Tocharians, a later group that spoke Indo-European languages and lived in the same region but many centuries afterward. For a long time, the Tarim mummies stood at the center of a mystery that nobody could fully explain. More clues finally came when scientists managed to break down the DNA of these bodies. The genetic results did not make things simpler. The tests showed that the mummies carried bloodlines from ancient Siberian hunters mixed with Bronze Age farmers who came from the highlands of Central Asia. They were not fully European or Asian. They formed their own blend, a group that built a life in the middle of the desert and created a culture that later got buried by sandstorms and forgotten for thousands of years. But even though these bodies shocked the world, they were not the most important discovery. The real twist came from a skeleton that was older by 10,000 years and found far away from the desert. While the Tarim Basin held bodies from 4,000 years ago, scientists uncovered a skull in southern China that reached back tens of thousands of years. The desert mummies looked unexpected, but this older skeleton carried DNA that seemed impossible. To reach this next discovery, researchers followed the trail thousands of miles south, straight into Yunnan province. Yunnan felt completely different from the dry north. Instead of endless dunes, the land rose up with wet forests, steep mountains, and twisting rivers. It stayed warm, humid, and full of life. In 1989, a team dug inside a place called the Red Deer Cave, named after the huge number of giant red deer bones scattered inside. Many of the bones showed marks from cutting and cooking, so it was clear that ancient people had settled there and eaten there for generations. While digging through the layers of ash, dirt, and animal remains, the team found pieces of a human skeleton. The skull cap became the most important piece, And right when the scientists picked it up, they noticed something unusual. This skull, which they later called Mengzi Ren, or MZR, did not match the features of modern humans from the region. It looked older, almost like a mix between ancient and modern traits. The brow ridge was heavy and thick, the skull seemed wide, and the jaw looked strong and deep. Even the nose opening appeared broader than expected. It looked like it came from a human who lived far earlier than the people of Asia, known from later periods. This one skull started a debate that lasted for 3 full decades. Researchers split into different camps. Some said the skull belonged to a member of a small group of ancient humans who had stayed hidden in the forests of Yunnan long after their relatives disappeared. Others pushed the idea that the skull came from a hybrid, a mix between Homo sapiens and another archaic human group. Many pointed to the Denisovans, who were known to have lived somewhere in Asia. The debate continued year after year, each new study adding more questions, but the biggest mystery still sat behind one single issue: the true age of the skull. DNA breakthrough that changed human history. When scientists managed to pull out a firm radiocarbon date for the mysterious skull was when the real shock arrived. The number pushed the whole research world into a new direction. The age of the skeleton did not fall into the range of ancient humans who lived tens of thousands of years earlier. The result showed that the bones came from someone who lived only about 14,000 years ago. This placed the woman right at the tail end of the last major ice age, a point in time when modern humans were believed to be the only people left on Earth. By that era, our species had already moved into Europe long ago, had spread down into Australia, and had stepped into the Americas as well. Yet in one hidden cave in China, a person lived who appeared to belong to a much older world. This single date pushed open a door to an unbelievable idea. It suggested that another type of human, or perhaps a human with older traits, might have lived alongside our direct ancestors much later than anyone expected. For almost 30 years, researchers circled around this puzzle and tried to sort out what Mengzi Ren truly represented. Some pushed the thought that she might be part of a new human species. Others believed she could be a mix, part modern and part ancient, created when two different human groups came together. Nobody had enough proof to settle the matter, and the skull stayed inside a museum collection like a question mark that refused to fade away. Everything began to change when new technology caught up in 2018. A group of Chinese scientists decided to pull DNA out of the skull, even though the local climate worked against them. DNA broke apart quickly over time, and it lasted best in places that stayed cold and dry. That was why ancient remains from Siberia produced clear DNA from bones that were over 40,000 years old, which helped researchers uncover groups like the Denisovans. But the hot and humid environment of Yunnan worked like a machine that broke DNA into tiny, useless pieces. Many experts thought it was pointless to even try, but the team did not give up. They drilled into the petrous part of the skull, a very dense bone hidden deep in the inner ear. This bone acted like a natural safe box, keeping traces of DNA locked away long after the rest of the skeleton lost its genetic material. The team worked inside sterile rooms, used cold processing methods, and sifted through huge amounts of contamination from soil and microbes. After a long and careful process, they finally pulled out a tiny amount of genetic code. It added up to less than 1% of the complete genome, but even that small amount was enough to break open the mystery. By 2022, the team released their results, and everything people thought they knew about this skull suddenly shifted. The DNA showed that Mengzi Ren did not belong to a new species, and she was not the result of mixing between modern humans and some unknown archaic group. She was fully and completely a Homo sapiens. She lived her life like any other modern human of her time, most likely passing away in her 20s or 30s. The facial features were from a population that had developed in ways not seen in later Asian groups, indicating that ancient modern humans carried far more physical variety than the groups living today. But while this settled one problem, the DNA opened up an even greater mystery. The researchers looked into her mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down only from mothers to their children. Her line belonged to a branch called R9C, a lineage that had vanished in the modern world. Nobody living in mainland Asia carried this line anymore. It stood as a remnant of a very old human group that had once lived in southern China for tens of thousands of years before fading away. This alone was stunning, but the story did not stop there. The team then dug into her nuclear DNA, the main set of genetic information inherited from both parents. They compared it with DNA from populations across the planet, both ancient samples and modern groups. After studying connection after connection, they uncovered something hidden deep inside the code. Mengzi Ren shared a clear and direct genetic link with the ancient ancestors of Native American peoples. Her DNA showed a close, sister-like match to groups known today as Paleo-Siberians, people who lived far to the north and later moved across the exposed land between Asia and North America during the end of the Ice Age. These travelers would eventually bring their bloodlines through Alaska and down into the two American continents. Modern Native American groups, stretching from the northern plains of North America all the way to communities deep in the Amazon, had a notable share of DNA that came from the same source. Researchers found that this amount usually reached somewhere between 9 and 15% of their total genetic code. And there in the cave in Yunnan stood a woman who belonged to that same root population, living her life and gathering red deer long before recorded history began. This created a question for researchers, one that forced them to rethink how people moved around the world long ago. The link between China and the first Americans. Mengzi Ren lived in southern China, far from the place where the ancestors of Native Americans eventually traveled. The distance between these 2 points stretched across more than 7,000 miles, across landscapes that today would seem impossible to cross in one lifetime. The surprising part was that her DNA placed her within the same ancestral group that later reached the far side of the Americas. This made her skull a central piece in a mystery that opened up huge gaps in the familiar story of human origins. Scientists needed to find an explanation, so they began to look farther back in time, into a world shaped by ice rather than oceans. During the period around 14,000 years ago, Earth held a completely different form. Giant ice sheets covered large parts of the northern world, pushing down over Canada and parts of the northern United States. Sea levels sat hundreds of feet lower than today. Wide stretches of land that now lie at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean once stood above the water. One of these exposed regions was the old land known as Beringia, a bridge of earth that linked Siberia and Alaska. Many people once believed that a single group of hunters moved across this land near the end of the Ice Age and spread into the Americas. This story painted a simple picture, but new findings showed that the real events were far more complex and stretched back far longer than anyone had guessed. The new research showed that Beringia was not a narrow path, but a huge subcontinent, filled with grasslands, animals, and enough space to support large human groups. Around 25,000 years ago, people from both Siberia and East Asia began to push into this land. These travelers reached the area when sea levels dropped low enough to connect the two sides of the northern world. But once they arrived, the expanding ice sheets trapped them. Glaciers blocked their way back into Asia from the west, while massive frozen walls in Canada blocked their way into the Americas from the east. This meant they could move into Beringia, but not out of it. So they remained there for roughly 10,000 years, which was a span of time far longer than all of recorded human history. Over those long centuries, they lived in isolation, hunting the animals of the region and forming a new mixed population. Inside that isolation, their DNA changed and drifted, creating a new blend of lineages pulled from earlier groups in both northern and southern East Asia. This unique genetic signature later moved into the Americas when ice finally pulled back and opened new passages. This blended group stood as the true ancestral source of Native American populations, rising from a mixture of northern East Asian hunters with southern East Asian groups, including those who resembled the population that Mengzi Ren belonged to. As scientists pieced together this story, they began to see how Mengzi Ren fit inside a much larger pattern. Through the connection, scientists were able to follow a clear line across time and space. They could follow it from the warm forests of southern China to the frozen landscapes near Siberia, then across the wide Beringian world, and finally down into the forests. The movement of her distant relatives created a bridge of ancestry that linked her population to the first people who built lives in the Americas. DNA trail across the Pacific. Mingzi Ren offered a final look at a lost group, a population that had nearly vanished from Asia. And what made the discovery even more striking was that she was not the only clue. Another major find from a completely different part of China supported the same deep story. This second discovery came from the north and involved a very old skeleton found in 2003 in Tianyuan Cave near Beijing. The cave sat thousands of miles from Yunnan, yet the two discoveries connected in surprising ways when studied more closely. The most shocking thing about the Tianyuan skeleton was its age. It was not from the end of the Ice Age, like Mingzi Ren. It was far older, about 40,000 years old, which pushed its story almost 3 times deeper into the past. This person lived in a time when Neanderthals still walked the earth, and giant Ice Age animals roamed across the land. Using new scientific methods, researchers pulled out DNA from bones and managed to build a full genetic picture of this ancient human. When researchers looked into his genome, they uncovered the same pattern shown in Mingzi Ren. Tianyuan Man turned out to be an early modern human who contributed both to later East Asian groups and to the ancestors of Native Americans. Because of this, Tianyuan Man and Mingzi Ren together formed a powerful link, showing that the ancient population that later helped form the first Americans was already spreading across China long before the Ice Age ended. This meant the shared ancestry between China and the Americas was not a recent or strange event. Mingzi Ren represented a later branch of that ancient line, while Tianyuan Man showed how early the line had begun to spread. But some researchers wondered if these discoveries still left part of the story unexplained. The main model, known as the Beringian standstill theory, seemed strong because it matched the genetic evidence. Still, a few scientists and many outside thinkers believed it did not answer every question. They pointed out that while the Beringian route worked, it was slow and extremely cold, and perhaps only one part of a larger picture. They asked whether another path across the Pacific might have existed long before modern history began. They wondered if very early humans could have crossed huge parts of the ocean using methods we have not yet discovered. And with that idea, the story opened up into something far more dramatic. Many scientists accepted the Beringian ghost population idea as the standard explanation, and it appeared in almost every classroom textbook. It looked neat and smooth, with each part fitting into the next like a clean puzzle. But for many people, something about it never felt complete. They felt that a story so old and so complex should have more twists. They looked at the Pacific Ocean, this huge space covering more of Earth than all the continents combined, and they wondered if humanity really treated it only as a giant wall. The Pacific stretched more than 10,000 miles from side to side, and for most of written history, people described it as an endless rise of water that kept worlds apart. But what if that was the wrong way to look at it? What if early humans saw it not as something stopping them, but as something they could move across? This question opened up a set of very bold ideas, and the surprising thing was that some of these ideas were supported by clues that were difficult to ignore. Many researchers pointed to the Polynesians. They were known to be among the greatest sailors the world ever produced. These people crossed huge stretches of ocean by watching the stars, feeling the waves, and paying attention to birds that circled above them. They moved across a giant triangle of ocean, reaching places like Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, long before Europeans even knew those islands existed. Their achievements stood out as some of the most impressive journeys humans ever carried out. Then came the turning point. There was solid evidence that Polynesians reached South America at least once. One simple plant proved it. The sweet potato had first been grown in the Andes, far across the ocean. Yet when European explorers reached the far Pacific centuries later, they found sweet potatoes already growing on remote Polynesian islands. Researchers pulled up ancient sweet potato samples and studied their DNA, and the results were clear. Polynesians had sailed all the way to South America, taken the plant, and sailed back across the ocean before the year 1200. This meant long-distance Pacific travel happened for real. And once that fact sank in, many people began asking whether much older coastal groups could have tried something similar. This question connected to an experiment carried out in 1947 by a man named Thor Heyerdahl, who believed early groups from South America could have reached Polynesia. To show it might be possible, he gathered a small team, built a simple raft using old methods, and pushed off the coast of Peru. He let the currents carry the raft, moving day after day under the sun and stars. After more than 3 months at sea, the raft reached a Polynesian atoll. His idea about the origins of Polynesians turned out to be wrong, but the journey proved something else. It showed that even with very basic tools, early groups could drift or sail across the Pacific if they understood the ocean. This possibility pushed people back to the discoveries in China. There was the ancient genetic link of Mingzi Ren, who lived 14,000 years ago. There was the much older Tianyuan individual who lived 40,000 years ago. Both belonged to coastal populations. What did coastal people usually do? They built simple boats, threw out nets, paddled along shorelines, and pushed into new places in search of food. If they moved along the coast for generations, how far could they have traveled? Could some groups have pushed out into deeper waters and been swept by currents toward lands none of them had seen before? These questions led to more controversial ideas. One famous example came from a theory published by Gavin Menzies. He argued that the great Chinese naval fleet led by Admiral Zheng He in the early 1400s did more than explore Asia and Africa. He claimed the fleet crossed the Pacific, sailed along the coast of the Americas, and even moved around the southern tip of the continent. Most historians rejected this strongly, saying the maps and records did not match the facts. Still, the idea forced people to think about what large fleets could accomplish if they pushed into unknown waters. And if people could do that in the 1400s, some wondered whether smaller, less prepared groups could have done it thousands of years earlier by accident or by desperation. The puzzle of haplogroup X. All of these debates return to a major genetic puzzle known as haplogroup X. It belonged to a small part of the Native American population, about 3%. It traced through the maternal line, just like Mingzi Ren's R9C group. The problem was that the other main Native American haplogroups matched East Asian origins very clearly. They fit the Beringian story. Haplogroup X did not. Its closest relatives appeared far away in the Middle East and in parts of Europe. It showed up in groups around the Mediterranean and in isolated pockets that had no direct link to East Asia. This raised a huge question of how a lineage from that region appeared in Native American communities, especially those around the Great Lakes thousands of years ago. The usual Beringian path did not explain it. Researchers tried to map out earlier paths, but none of them perfectly fit the pattern. The mystery stayed open, leaving room for new ideas and unknown journeys that could have taken place long before recorded history ever began. Some researchers pointed to the strange pattern in haplogroup X and tried to build an explanation around it. This unusual lineage pushed people toward bold ideas, including one argument that ancient groups from Europe traveled across the Atlantic by moving along the edges of the ice. Supporters of this idea believed these groups used simple skin boats and followed the frozen shelf until they reached North America. Most scientists pushed this aside and said the journey would have been too dangerous and too cold. The mainstream view said haplogroup X still came from Asia, from a hidden Siberian population that mixed with groups from both the East and the West. That lost population, under the standard model, crossed into Beringia and moved down into the Americas. But because no skeletons had been found to confirm this, the explanation depended on many guesses that needed more evidence. People who enjoyed exploring unconventional ideas looked at this gap and argued that the official version left too many questions open. They examined the unexpected link in haplogroup X, compared it with the southern Chinese ancestry shown in Mingzi Ren, and said the land bridge alone could not explain everything. They pushed the idea that the ocean itself played a bigger role than anyone admitted. This led them toward the most extreme idea of all, a theory placed deep in fringe thinking, known as the concept of Mu. According to that idea, there was once a huge continent in the middle of the Pacific. It was described as warm, fertile, and full of an early advanced society. Supporters believed this lost world collapsed in a sudden disaster, leaving survivors who escaped in every direction. Some supposedly reached South America, while others ended up in Asia and carried their traditions with them. Followers of the Mu theory used this story to build a connection between distant populations. They claimed that groups in China and groups in South America did not share ancestry because they traveled great distances, but because they both came from this lost homeland. They pushed this idea whenever someone brought up the strange genetic patterns, saying it tied everything together in a single origin point. But geologists looked into the ocean floor and showed that no such continent ever existed, leaving the Mu idea without physical evidence. Even so, it continued to attract attention because people often searched for hidden stories beneath the surface of history. When researchers uncovered more ghost populations in Siberia and more unexpected gene links in Asia, the imagination naturally moved toward dramatic possibilities. Each new discovery made people wonder if early humans lived through events that never made it into written memory. As researchers worked through these arguments, attention shifted toward the different timeline markers that framed this entire story. There was the early reference to a 4,000-year-old skeleton, which turned out to be part of a misunderstanding related to the Tarim mummies in Western China. Those remains were real and remarkable, but they connected to groups from Europe and Central Asia, not to the first Americans. They told a different story that belonged to another chapter of human movement. At the center of this narrative remained the important discovery of Mingzi Ren. Her unusual appearance came from a population that carried wide genetic variety that eventually disappeared as newer populations spread through the region. The gap came from her genetic link to Native American groups. However, when researchers looked back at the ancient timeline, compared her DNA to Tianyuan man from 40,000 years ago, and traced how those early coastal groups moved across Asia, the picture slowly came together. The story pointed toward a long stay in Beringia, where mixed groups from both the Siberian north and the southern coastline merged and formed a new population. That population remained cut off for thousands of years as ice blocked the way south. During that long isolation, they built up a unique genetic identity. Much later, when the world warmed and the ice sheets pulled back, their descendants spread into the Americas and filled an entire hemisphere. Do you think the early humans could have used an undiscovered method to cross the Pacific Ocean? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.